The hum of the airplane engines was almost soothing, a rhythmic backdrop to the tension brewing inside the cabin. Jack Morrison adjusted his seatbelt and glanced out the window as the early morning sun pierced through the clouds. The flight from New York to London was supposed to be routine, but the icy voice that cut through the cabin shattered that illusion. "Sir, I'll say it again." The flight attendant's voice was sharp, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You need to move to the back. First class is reserved for our premium passengers." Jack turned to face her. Her name tag read Victoria Scott. Her eyes held a cold authority, as if she were talking to an unruly teenager, not a grown man in his 40s. He remained calm, his voice measured. "My ticket is for this seat. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. One man discreetly raised his phone, recording the scene. Jack's tailored suit and confident demeanor contrasted starkly with the accusation implied by Victoria's stance. "Sir," she said, her voice thick with condescension, "I'm asking you nicely. People like you usually sit in the back." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Jack felt his jaw tighten. He had dealt with this before, not often, but enough to recognize the pattern. He kept his voice even. "I paid for this seat just like everyone else here. I'm not moving." Victoria turned abruptly and marched toward the front of the cabin. A nervous ripple passed through the passengers. Jack exhaled slowly, his pulse quickening. He wasn't just any passenger. He was the owner of this airline, traveling incognito to experience the service firsthand. From the front of the cabin, the younger flight attendant, Lisa Thompson, shifted uneasily. She had been watching the situation unfold and now hesitated near Jack's seat. "I'm really sorry about this, sir," she whispered. "She's stubborn." "Not your fault," Jack said, managing a small smile. Minutes later, Victoria returned, her expression even more rigid. "If you don't move, I'll call security when we land." "Do what you need to do," Jack replied. Passengers began murmuring, some leaning forward to get a better view. A man across the aisle, dressed in a navy blazer, cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said to Victoria. "The man's got his ticket. Let him sit in peace." "Sir, this doesn't concern you," she snapped. "It concerns all of us," the man said. "We paid for a comfortable flight, not a sideshow." Victoria turned on her heel and stormed toward the galley. Jack sighed and turned his gaze back to the window. The horizon stretched endlessly ahead, but his thoughts were rooted in the confrontation he knew was far from over. He wasn't here to cause trouble, but he also wasn't here to tolerate injustice. The true test of his company's values was unfolding at 30,000 feet, and Jack Morrison, whether he liked it or not, was at the center of it. The tension inside the cabin intensified as the minutes dragged on. Jack Morrison shifted in his seat, his eyes following Victoria Scott as she paced near the galley, clearly agitated. The murmurs among passengers grew louder, fueled by confusion and discomfort. Jack wasn't a stranger to conflict resolution, but this was different. Here, he was just another passenger to everyone else, though the situation was about to take a turn no one expected. Victoria returned, her steps quick and purposeful. Stopping beside Jack's seat, she raised her voice just enough to ensure everyone in first class heard. "Sir, if you continue to disrupt the cabin, I'll have to escalate this." Jack inhaled deeply, keeping his temper in check. "Sitting in my assigned seat isn't a disruption," he replied evenly. "You're the one creating the scene." Her face flushed and she turned to Lisa Thompson, who stood nearby, fidgeting with the beverage cart. "Get the captain on the intercom," Victoria ordered. "Tell him we've got a situation." Lisa hesitated, glancing at Jack before reluctantly heading to the cockpit. The passengers shifted in their seats. The man in the navy blazer, who had defended Jack earlier, leaned forward. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you're overreacting." Victoria shot him a glare. "This isn't your concern." "It is when a fellow passenger is being harassed," he countered. Jack rubbed his temples. The situation was spiraling, and he knew it was time to think several steps ahead. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Miss Scott, please report to the cockpit immediately." Victoria's jaw tightened, but she obeyed. As she walked away, Lisa returned with a tray of water and set it on Jack's table. "Sir, I'm so sorry," she said softly. "She's not usually like this." "You don't have to apologize," Jack said. "You've done nothing wrong." Minutes later, Victoria re-emerged from the cockpit, her face pale but her eyes blazing with renewed determination. She didn't look at Jack as she strode past, but instead addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disturbance. We'll continue beverage service shortly." Her tone lacked any genuine remorse, and passengers exchanged wary glances. The man with the navy blazer shook his head. "She's not letting this go," he muttered. Jack agreed but said nothing. His mind was already processing the next steps. The company's values were clear: respect, fairness, and professionalism. And here, on his own flight, those principles were being trampled in real time. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, shaking the cabin briefly. Jack's knuckles whitened on the armrest, not from fear but from the weight of the situation. He wasn't just defending himself, he was standing for every passenger who had ever been treated as less than. The turbulence passed, but the air remained charged. Jack opened his phone and drafted a message to his senior operations officer. "Incident in progress on Flight 217. Need immediate review. Will provide full details upon landing." He hit send just as Victoria returned with the beverage cart. Her smile was forced, her hands trembling slightly as she served the other passengers. When she reached Jack, she didn't offer a drink. Instead, she leaned in close enough that only he could hear. "You think you're special, don't you?" she hissed. Jack held her gaze without flinching. "No," he said softly, "but I expect the same respect as anyone else." Victoria straightened and moved on, but the encounter had left a scar in the cabin's collective consciousness. Jack noticed more phones raised, more wary glances exchanged. This incident wasn't going unnoticed, and he knew public scrutiny would soon follow. As the flight continued over the Atlantic, Jack leaned back in his seat. He wasn't here just to evaluate service quality anymore. He was witnessing a systemic issue firsthand, and when they landed, the reckoning would begin. The cabin remained thick with tension as the flight continued its journey across the Atlantic. Jack Morrison kept his gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the window, the vast sky offering a stark contrast to the unrest brewing inside the plane. The murmurs of concerned passengers hadn't stopped since the confrontation. Jack's phone vibrated in his hand. A response from his operations officer, Matt Reynolds. "Got it. Monitoring situation. We'll coordinate with ground staff in London." Jack exhaled slowly, grateful for the quick action. He knew the company's values were only as strong as their enforcement. The moments that tested those principles mattered most. Victoria Scott hovered near the galley, glancing toward Jack's seat with a mix of defiance and uncertainty. Her rigid posture betrayed her growing realization that she'd crossed a line. She fiddled with the intercom handset, her knuckles pale from the grip. Lisa Thompson moved quietly past her, continuing beverage service with visible tension in her steps. A sudden jolt of turbulence rattled the cabin. Passengers gasped, some clutching their armrests. Jack's eyes shifted to Victoria, who stumbled slightly but recovered. Her eyes met his for a fleeting second before she turned away. The man in the navy blazer leaned across the aisle. "She's unraveling," he said under his breath. "Not a great look for the airline." "No," Jack agreed, "but it's a chance to learn something." He tapped his phone and opened the Notes app, documenting key moments of the incident. His company prided itself on accountability, and this situation demanded it. Minutes later, Victoria stepped into the aisle and addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to minor turbulence, beverage service is temporarily paused. We appreciate your patience." Her voice trembled slightly, but she masked it with a forced smile. As she turned, her gaze locked on Jack with thinly veiled resentment. Jack shifted his focus back to his notes. His thoughts drifted to the broader implications. One employee's behavior could damage the reputation the company had spent decades building. He'd always believed in the power of culture to shape performance, but now he was witnessing what happened when that culture eroded. In the row ahead, a middle-aged woman turned to whisper to her companion. "I read an article about this airline," she said. "They're supposed to be really big on customer service. Doesn't seem like it today." Jack felt the sting of her words. He wasn't angry at her observation. He was angry that it was accurate. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we expect a smooth remainder of the flight. Thank you for your patience." Jack appreciated the captain's professionalism, but he knew it wouldn't erase the damage already done. Victoria reappeared near his seat, her shoulders squared. "Sir," she said, voice taut, "I need you to stop causing disruptions." Jack's brows furrowed. "Disruptions? I haven't moved or spoken out of turn." "Your presence is unsettling passengers," she snapped. The absurdity of the statement struck Jack, but he remained composed. "If anyone here is unsettled," he said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "it's because of how you've handled this situation." The navy blazer man gave a quiet, "Hear, hear," drawing nods from others. Victoria flushed and stepped back. The tension thickened as the flight continued its steady path across the ocean. Jack checked his watch. 3 hours until landing. He settled into his seat, mentally preparing for the steps he would take once on the ground. As the cabin lights dimmed for the evening portion of the flight, Jack closed his eyes for a moment. The whispers of passengers blended with the steady hum of the engines. The company's mission statement echoed in his mind. "We elevate experiences by elevating people." Today, that mission was being put to the test, and the next few hours would determine whether it held true. "I can see that," Jack said, lips pressed in a tight line. As the captain returned to the cockpit, Lisa resumed beverage service, visibly more at ease. Jack caught her eye and gave her an encouraging nod. The flight attendants who embodied the company's values deserved support. The landing announcement crackled through the speakers. Passengers began adjusting their seats and fastening seatbelts. The lights brightened slightly, casting a stark clarity over the strained expressions around the cabin. Jack's phone buzzed one final time before descent. "Matt Reynolds, media already picking up passenger videos, preparing statement for your review." He responded, "Good, we'll own it, no excuses." The cabin lights flickered slightly as the aircraft cruised through the night sky, slicing through the darkness toward London. Jack Morrison sat upright, his mind racing with calculations and potential outcomes. He wasn't just a passenger caught in a tense confrontation. He was the leader of a company facing a glaring crack in its core principles. His phone vibrated again. "Matt Reynolds, we've alerted Heathrow ground staff. Security team briefed and ready." He typed back, "Thanks, prepare PR response. Focus on accountability, transparency, and respect." Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer gave a nod. "Looks like she's finally gone quiet," he murmured. Jack followed his gaze. Victoria Scott Rue is no longer pacing near the galley. Instead, she was standing rigidly by the cabin door, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Her eyes occasionally darted toward Jack, and when they met his, her expression darkened. The atmosphere remained tense, and passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. Jack could sense their discomfort, their silent observation of a drama that had turned their flight into a spectacle. He shifted his gaze to the window, the vastness of the night sky offering a brief reprieve. Suddenly, Victoria strode toward him. Jack braced himself, anticipating another hostile encounter. "Sir," she said, voice low but sharp, "you think you've won here, don't you?" "I'm not trying to win," Jack responded, keeping his voice calm. "I'm trying to travel in the seat I paid for, just like everyone else." She scoffed, shaking her head. "Some people always assume they belong everywhere." Lisa Thompson approached cautiously, stepping between them. "Victoria, maybe you should take a break," she suggested softly. "I'm fine," Victoria snapped. Jack leaned back, studying her. There was more here than simple hostility. Her anger seemed deeply rooted, and it wasn't just about him. He glanced around the cabin. Passengers pretended to read or sleep, but their attention was unmistakably fixed on the confrontation. The captain's voice broke the tension. "Miss Scott, please report to the cockpit immediately." Victoria's face tightened and she pivoted toward the front of the plane. As she passed Lisa, she hissed, "This isn't over." Lisa exhaled shakily and turned toward Jack. "I'm sorry," she said again. "You've apologized enough," Jack said softly. "Just stay professional. You're doing great." Minutes passed, and Jack let himself relax slightly. The hum of the engines and the faint murmur of passengers settled into a nervous rhythm. He glanced at his phone, opened the company's core values document, and reread the principles he'd sworn to uphold when he founded the airline. Respect, integrity, safety, empathy. The glaring disconnect between these ideals and the night's events gnawed at him. The cockpit door opened, and the captain emerged with a stern expression. He scanned the cabin and approached Jack. "Mr. Morrison," he said, voice low, "we'll be landing shortly. Ground staff is ready to handle the situation." "Thank you, Captain," Jack replied. The captain's eyes flicked toward the galley. "She's been relieved of duties for the remainder of the flight," he added. "But she's not taking it well." As the plane descended toward the twinkling lights of London, Jack's jaw tightened. This incident was more than just a PR crisis. It was a defining moment for the airline, and for himself as a leader. The wheels of the plane hit the runway with a jarring thud, jolting the passengers as the aircraft slowed to a crawl along Heathrow's slick tarmac. Jack Morrison sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly together. The events of the flight still weighed heavily on him. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer gave him a knowing nod. "Showtime," he mouthed. The plane reached the gate and the seatbelt sign went off with a familiar chime. Jack remained seated as passengers unbuckled and stretched. From the window, he spotted two uniformed security officers standing by the jet bridge entrance. Victoria Scott was still in the galley, her back stiff, her expression unreadable. Lisa Thompson moved through the cabin, assisting passengers with overhead luggage. When she reached Jack, she hesitated. "Sir, security's ready. They asked if you wanted to speak with them first." "No," Jack said, voice steady. "Let them handle it. We'll deal with the aftermath through proper channels." Lisa gave a quick nod and walked toward the front. Moments later, the security officers boarded. Their presence drew the attention of the passengers and the murmurs returned. Jack watched as the officers approached Victoria. One officer spoke to her quietly, while the other stood guard. Her eyes darted around the cabin, landing on Jack. "This is ridiculous," Victoria spat as the officers instructed her to gather her belongings. "I was just doing my job." The officer maintained a professional tone. "Miss Scott, please comply. We'll sort it out later." Victoria hesitated, then yanked her tote bag from the overhead compartment. As she passed Jack's seat, she paused. "You set me up," she hissed. "This is your fault." Jack met her glare without flinching. "No," he said softly. "You did this to yourself." The officers escorted her from the plane, and passengers broke into hushed conversations. The man in the navy blazer leaned toward Jack. "Well," he said, "I bet that video's already viral." Jack's phone buzzed. A text from Matt Reynolds. Video hit 1 million views. Media requesting statements. He stood and adjusted his jacket. "Time to face the music," he muttered to himself. As he exited the plane, the buzz of conversation followed him into the terminal. Heathrow's security team guided him to a private lounge. Matt Reynolds was already there, seated at a table with his laptop open. "Jack," Matt said, standing quickly, "it's all over the news. We've drafted a preliminary statement focusing on accountability and our commitment to passenger safety." "Good," Jack said, scanning the text. "Make sure it doesn't read like corporate damage control. This isn't about optics. It's about doing what's right." Matt gave a tight nod. "Understood." A knock at the door interrupted them. A middle-aged man with a Heathrow ID badge stepped inside. "Mr. Morrison, the police are taking Miss Scott's statement. She claims she was defending airline policy." Jack pinched the bridge of his nose. "Let the authorities handle it. Our response remains the same. We do not tolerate discriminatory behavior." Hours later, Jack sat across from a reporter for a live interview. The studio lights cast sharp shadows across his face, but his voice remained even. "What happened on that flight was unacceptable," he said. "Our passengers trust us to treat everyone with dignity and respect, and we failed. But we will learn from this. We've already begun implementing new training programs to address these issues head-on." The interviewer raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Critics say this incident reflects deeper cultural problems. Do you agree?" Jack didn't hesitate. Culture isn't defined by a single person's actions, but it is tested by moments like these, and our response will show who we truly are. The next morning, Jack sat in his office watching the sunrise. His phone buzzed with countless messages, some supportive, others critical. Lisa's name appeared on the screen. He answered, "Sir, just wanted to say, thank you for standing up for us." Jack smiled faintly. "Lisa, you stood up for what's right when it mattered most. The real thanks goes to you." Jack Morrison sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on the glowing cityscape of London through the window. The night sky mirrored the turbulence he felt inside. His phone buzzed again, another notification about the flight incident that had captured national attention. He unlocked the screen to see the latest headline: "CEO confronts discrimination mid-flight, a lesson in leadership." He set the phone aside and turned to his laptop. His inbox was flooded with messages from colleagues, media outlets, and concerned customers. Public reaction was mixed, praise for his composure and outrage over the flight attendant's behavior. The airline's stock had dipped slightly, but analysts predicted a recovery if the company handled the situation well. Matt Reynolds called, his voice tense. "Jack, the press wants a follow-up statement. They're asking about policy changes and whether Victoria Scott's actions were symptomatic of a larger cultural problem." "They're right to ask," Jack said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Draft a statement. We'll own the problem and outline the changes we're implementing. No sugarcoating." "Got it," Matt said. "Oh, and HR has completed their initial investigation. Victoria had multiple complaints filed against her in the past. They were dismissed as minor incidents." Jack's jaw tightened. That's the root of it then. We let things slide. Yeah, Matt agreed. This wasn't an isolated event. Jack ended the call and stood by the window again. He thought of his father's words when he'd first taken over the company. Reputation is earned in moments, not years. This was one of those moments. The next morning, Jack met with his executive team. We're implementing mandatory training on bias and professional conduct for every employee, he announced, top to bottom, and we're establishing an independent oversight committee to handle complaints. No more sweeping issues under the rug. The team exchanged glances but nodded in agreement. The head of HR raised a hand. How do we communicate this to the public without sounding reactive? We don't spin it, Jack said. We tell the truth. Meanwhile, Victoria Scott sat in a police interview room, arms crossed and eyes defiant. I was enforcing policy, she repeated to the officer across from her. That passenger was out of place. The officer exchanged a look with his partner. Miss Scott, the evidence shows otherwise, he said, and you assaulted a passenger in front of dozens of witnesses. He provoked me, she snapped. The officer remained impassive, taking notes. Outside, news crews gathered near the precinct, eager for updates. The video from the plane had gone viral, with commentators dissecting every second of the incident. Some defended Victoria, claiming she'd acted under stress. Most condemned her behavior. In the weeks that followed, Jack led the charge to overhaul the airline's policies. He visited training sessions, spoke with flight crews, and personally responded to dozens of customer emails. The company introduced anonymous reporting channels and stricter hiring protocols. Lisa Thompson became a visible advocate for the new initiatives. It's not just about following rules, she said in an interview. It's about understanding that every passenger deserves respect. Jack watched her interview with pride. She embodied the principles he was determined to reinforce. Public sentiment shifted as people saw the airline's commitment to change. This isn't just PR, one passenger commented online. They're actually doing something. One evening, Jack received a handwritten letter from a retired flight attendant. Thank you, it read, for reminding the world that dignity in the skies matters. He set the letter down and stared out the window. The journey wasn't over, but the company was finally heading in the right direction. The weeks after the incident were a blur of meetings, interviews, and strategic decisions. Jack Morrison navigated the chaos with a determined calm, knowing the future of his airline depended on how they responded to this moment. The media had latched onto the story, dissecting every detail, while the public's eyes remained fixed on the company's next steps. Jack knew they had to act swiftly, but thoughtfully. He stood in the conference room of the corporate headquarters, facing his executive team. We're not just addressing one incident, he said. We're fixing a systemic issue. This isn't about PR, it's about our culture. Matt Reynolds nodded. The training modules are nearly complete. HR finalized the content with input from external consultants. Good, Jack replied. Launch the program next week. Make participation mandatory for everyone, from frontline staff to executives. Later that day, Jack visited the training facility where Lisa Thompson was preparing materials for the first group of trainees. How's it going? He asked. Lisa smiled, though fatigue lined her face. We're getting there, she said. People are receptive. They want to see change. So do I, Jack said, glancing at the posters that adorned the walls. Slogans like respect in the skies and service with empathy served as visual reminders of their mission. Meanwhile, Victoria Scott's case was moving through the legal system. News reports painted her as a cautionary tale, a professional undone by her own biases. In a televised interview, her former colleague described her as someone who let her personal prejudices override her professionalism. Victoria herself remained unrepentant. In a statement given through her attorney, she claimed she'd been scapegoated. I was enforcing company policy, the statement read. I've become a victim of political correctness. The airline issued a public response emphasizing its zero-tolerance stance on discriminatory behavior. Jack personally signed the statement, ensuring the company's position was clear. In the months that followed, the training program rolled out across the organization. Employees attended interactive workshops, role-playing real-life scenarios to practice respectful, effective communication. Lisa became the face of the initiative, her first-hand experience lending credibility to the sessions. One afternoon, Jack joined a session unannounced. He watched from the back of the room as Lisa described the incident with Victoria Scott. Not the sensationalized version the media had covered, but the real emotions behind it. When you treat someone as less than, Lisa said, you don't just hurt them. You hurt the integrity of the entire team. Respect isn't a buzzword, it's a responsibility. The room fell silent as her words sank in. Jack felt a surge of pride. Lisa was right. Culture wasn't dictated by policies alone. It was built through daily actions. Public perception of the airline gradually shifted. Customers shared stories online about positive experiences with flight attendants who went out of their way to be helpful and kind. One post from a mother traveling with her autistic son went viral. "The crew was incredible," she wrote. "They made us feel welcome and safe. Thank you for making respect more than just a slogan." Jack forwarded the post to the entire company with a simple message. "This is what we stand for." One evening, as he was leaving the office, Jack's phone buzzed. It was Lisa. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling with excitement, "you won't believe this." "What happened?" "We just got an award from the National Aviation Association. Best in customer care for the quarter." Jack smiled, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "That's fantastic," he said. "Congratulations to you and the team." He hung up and stood for a moment in the empty office. The incident on Flight 217 had exposed a weakness, but it also revealed the company's capacity for growth. Jack knew the work wasn't over, but tonight he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Jack Morrison sat alone in the executive lounge of JFK Airport, gazing out at the runway where planes taxied in rhythmic succession. The glow of city lights painted the tarmac in streaks of gold, mirroring the myriad thoughts racing through his mind. Months had passed since the incident aboard Flight 217, and though the turbulence of that day had faded, its lessons remained sharp. His phone buzzed. It was Lisa Thompson. "Sir, we just got the final passenger satisfaction report for the year." "And?" Jack asked, a smile already forming. 96% positive feedback," she said, her voice trembling with pride. "Highest in company history." "That's incredible," Jack said softly. "Tell the team I'm proud of them." He ended the call and leaned back in his chair. The numbers confirmed what he had already sensed. Culture had shifted. Respect wasn't just a word in a training manual anymore. It was part of the airline's heartbeat. As he stood to gather his things, a familiar voice caught his attention. "Excuse me, sir, can I help you?" He turned and saw a flight attendant assisting an elderly couple with their luggage. Her uniform was neat, her smile genuine, her tone patient. The older woman placed a hand on the attendant's arm. "Thank you, dear. You remind me of my granddaughter, always so kind." The attendant laughed softly. "I'm happy to help, ma'am. Enjoy your flight." Jack's heart swelled with pride. This was the culture he'd fought to rebuild. He checked the attendant's name tag, Lisa Thompson. The flight to London was smooth. Jack watched from his seat as Lisa moved through the cabin, offering warm smiles and thoughtful gestures. He closed his eyes, feeling the calm satisfaction of a leader who'd witnessed growth from hardship. But as the plane began its descent, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lisa's voice came through steady and clear. "We'll be landing shortly. Thank you for flying with us. And if you look out the right side of the plane, you'll see something special. A sunrise over London, a reminder that even after the darkest nights, light always returns." Passengers turned to the windows, murmurs of awe filling the cabin. Jack followed suit. The horizon was painted in hues of crimson and gold, an ethereal sight that seemed almost symbolic. Then, his phone vibrated one last time, a message from an unknown number. "Good job cleaning up the mess. Remember, culture isn't built overnight. Stay vigilant." Jack's pulse quickened as he reread the text. He looked around the cabin, scanning the faces. No one seemed out of place. The warmth of the sunrise now felt cold against his skin. He leaned back and stared at the message again. The airline had transformed, but shadows lingered. And as the wheels touched the ground, Jack realized something profound. Growth wasn't a destination, but a continuous journey. He smiled, exhaled, and whispered to himself, "Bring it on."